It's great to be here. This has been one of the most interesting conferences I've ever attended. Thank you, Tani, Steve, Brian, and Megan, and Rachel, and Absentia. I think what makes this conference so interesting is that we're all so different. And yet we found this idea of ephemera very, very interesting. I had never thought about ephemera until I started talking to Tani about it. And I immediately realized that it would have relevance to my own research, which is on maps. So what I thought I would do today is to reflect a bit as an historian about maps as ephemera. And I've added a question mark to my title as originally published because I want to suggest that maps are and are not ephemera. So we're going to talk first about some contemporary examples of maps that we all know, and some have even included some maps that we saw here in the conference. But then I want to segue to my own research on maps in the 16th century, and what my interest is with maps is how Brazil was first represented on maps. And so I thank the Chow Center for being willing to include this Brazilian perspective. Okay, so maps as ephemera. This is a picture of a map that I took from the newspaper the first day of the conference. I've always been fascinated by the weather maps that appear in the newspaper. So this is an obvious example of map as ephemera. This is the definition of ephemera that I came to getting ready for this conference, and I think most of this has been upheld throughout our discussions over the past 2 days. First of all, ephemera it has this practicality, utilitarian nature to it, in addition to being produced for a short amount of time, no intention of permanence. Highly collectible. We've often talked about the collector over the past 2 days, and I think the collectability of ephemera is related to its artistic content that is fascinating to collectors. We also heard about the affective side of ephemera, which I hadn't really thought about, but that also makes it interesting to collectors. We've talked about how ephemera falls through the cracks of archives. We've talked about how revealing it is for reconstructing daily life. And we've also talked about how it codes social objectives and meanings. So clearly maps fit all of these different characteristics of the definition. So here's an example of a map that everyone here has probably printed and discarded in the past day or two. Maybe zoomed in closer to the Hotel Zaza, but this is a very familiar piece of map as ephemera. All of us have probably used Google Earth, and this is an image of Google Earth that I use a lot, which is showing the approach to Brazil that would have been taken by seafarers in the 16th century, stopping first in Africa and sailing across the Atlantic. And I've used this and made, traced routes on it. And I've never thought to save these. They're always just gone after I figure out how many miles they've traveled. So another piece of of maps as ephemera. This is a digitized copy of the road map. All of us are rapidly discarding our road maps as we get GPS systems, and we discarded them anyway to get the most recent version of a road map. So road maps, and this is digitized at UT, but the digital copy of this map does not capture one of the most, frustrating, implicit natures of a road map, which is how do you fold it back up again after you've unfolded it? So that never is. I mean, you can regain the information from the digital copy, but you can't get that feeling of how hard it is to fold that map back up. This came from Melissa's presentation. This is a great example of a piece of ephemera that we saw in the course of the conference. She used it to make a point. Maps are used often to make arguments, and so she was making an argument about how the blue areas of the map are characteristic of more heavily governed regions. I hope I'm correct on that. And the lighter, the green and the white on the map are local areas that have fewer governing agencies. So this was part of the argument that she was making about how election ephemera is captured in local areas all over the United States. We had another map from Beverly, who was talking about her Asian American health survey in Houston, and she was using a map. A very common use of the map today is to geographically code data. So this is a census map that's showing where Asian Americans live in Houston. And then we had 3 presentations yesterday that also had maps. Jim, your presentation on the missing camels had a map or 2, I believe. Craig, you had some beautiful maps that were related, that were very artistic in the way in which you were showing where the photographs were from. And Jennifer had several maps, also very ephemeral in her presentation. Particularly, I remember the doll with the map on it. So obviously maps are ephemera, but they do many things, and maps encode many messages. So when we try and get back to our definition of what is ephemera, they do and do not fit, because not all maps are practical, not all maps are utilitarian, some are clearly intended to be permanent, and maps, probably, of all the ephemera we've talked about, are the most heavily archived. I mean, every archive has got maps in it. So it's not a problem that maps aren't archived. So now I want to talk about the history, a very rapid history of maps as ephemera, focusing on when maps start to become more ephemeral. Because obviously our modern maps are, we can agree that they have many characteristics of ephemera. But that was not always so. And here I'm going to limit myself to Western European maps, though there's a wonderful tradition of Chinese mapping, but I don't know anything about it, so I won't attempt to talk about it. So if you think about medieval European maps, they were clearly not ephemera. They were intended to be preserved. They were often made on vellum, highly illuminated. They carried many important religious messages. They often, this particular map hung in a cathedral, and so this was not a piece of ephemera. Similarly, this is a map by Fra Mauro, who was a monk living near Venice. He made 2 maps like this, one of which was commissioned by the Portuguese crown, and it contains very detailed information. This is Africa here. Very detailed information along the coast of Africa that records where the Portuguese have been traveling, the kinds of trade they're engaging in. He had many sources for this map. Again, not a piece of ephemera. This was a map that was meant to be contemplated, and it's believed that it hung in one of the castles in Portugal, and it kind of reinforced the idea that the Portuguese had that Africa was circumnavigable. And so you can see the passageway here to India. So this map was meant to be contemplated and not a piece of ephemera, even though the map that once hung in the Portuguese court has disappeared and no one's seen it for 500 years. So it became ephemeral, but it was never intended to be. And then you have, in the Renaissance, this explosion of map making, both printed maps and manuscript maps that are related to the rediscovery of the work of the Greek geographer Ptolemy, who lived in Alexandria in the 2nd century. And when his work was rediscovered in the Renaissance, there was a huge process of recreating his knowledge. His maps did not survive, but he talked about his maps in texts that did survive. And so humanists were very interested in recreating these maps, and these were also not ephemeral because they were either manuscript maps that were made that were very expensive, or they appeared in very expensive editions of Ptolemy's Geographia, so they don't really fit our definition of ephemera. So it seems as though in the Western European tradition that's leading up to where my interests are in the way in which Brazil appears on maps, that our first examples of ephemeral maps are Portolanos, or sea charts. And there's a 400-year period when these were made in Europe, initially around the Mediterranean. Really, that's the heart of where this Portolano tradition comes from. These were the charts used by sailors. They were made on vellum or animal skins. And so they had a utilitarian focus, which was to be taken to sea. The vast majority of these have been lost, and the ones that do survive because they were considered to be works of art. So here's an example of a Portolano, and you can see here's Spain. This is the Mediterranean discussion back, and here's the coast of Africa. And characteristic of the Portolanos is that the place names along the coast were written at right angles to the coast. And so this would be initially an accompaniment to a written sailing log or a rudder that sailors and pilots would use to find their way. And there's a lot of discussion among cartographic historians about how important these really were, because sailors relied on oral information. They returned to places they'd been to before, and they also had these detailed rudders. But what happens to the Portolano tradition is that originally it's developed for the Mediterranean, but it becomes very important as the coast of Africa is sailed along in the 15th and 16th centuries, and the Americas as well. And so the Portolanos start to contain more and more information on new places, and they're easily adaptable for that purpose. So it's a matter of, you know, changing where you start, how high up you begin where you place Spain, for example, and you can add on places in your in the mapping. Now this one and the one before, you have a very good example of a highly decorated Portolan chart that probably was never intended to go to sea. This was too expensive to go to sea. The first one probably did go to sea, because you can see the nail holes here. There's nail on a rod rolled up, and that would be easy to store on board ship. But these more elaborate ones were probably commissioned by princes or merchants, and so they didn't go to sea. Okay, now here's an interesting development, which is that the canvas gets turned. Traditionally, the Portolans all look like this. The neck of the animal, which is here, skin, okay, is facing to the west. But when you're trying to show the coastline of Africa, it's easier to have the neck at the top, so you can show more of the north-south, you know, the progression to the south. And in this particular case, the second coastline is meant to go right here. But it's expensive to have another piece of vellum, so why not just have your extra coastline? The sailor or navigator is going to know exactly what that means. Okay, so these kinds of charts have some visual iconography that's shared throughout them. So you've probably already started to notice that many of them have flags on them. They also have compass roses on them. These were, a Portolan chart had a navigational potential associated with it. So you had to have the compass rose on. You also had to have the scale on. So these are visual characteristics of these maps that repeat from chart to chart in different ways. So these are the things that you would expect to find on a Portolan chart if you were making one or if you were trying to read one, and so forth. And one of the interesting things that I've discovered about thinking about maps as ephemera is that, as we know, maps are very visual documents, and there are lots of visual icons on maps. And so even though the parchment disappears or the paper disappears when we get to printed maps, the visual icons keep reappearing. And so we start to see this with Portolano charts, that you expect to find these flags, these compass roses, these scales. And this particular medium was very useful in not just recording new information, but it leads to a fascinating and fundamental shift of the way in which the world is imagined. And I think it's really interesting that this comes from the practical knowledge of sailors. It does not come originally from the educated humanists. And that is that the way in which the cartographers captured the oral information coming back from overseas voyages was allowed to be put together to create a new view of the world. Okay, so let me jump from this slide to this one. This is what I want to get to. This is one of my favorite maps of the world. This is 1502, made by an anonymous cartographer in Portugal, and it shows how the practical knowledge of seafarers created a very new vision of the world. And it's a vision of the world that still is very much with us. This is pre-Mercator by 60 years, but you can kind of see the elements of the Mercator projection already in this map, even though this map does not have a real projection. So getting back to the significance of Portolano charts, they establish a visual iconography that we can still see even today. You know, the way in which north appears on a map is very much related to these compass roses that we just saw. They were able to incorporate new information. That's a very important part of maps, is that they carry information, and it was a flexible medium. Okay, so let's talk now about printed maps, which are another form of maps as ephemera that emerge in the 16th century. And here we need to go to Germany, where printing really begins. And we have many centers of printing in Germany, and many artists. One thing I should have mentioned talking about the Portolano charts, or at least mentioned more explicitly, is the important role of the artists. There's a lot of artistry in maps, especially maps that are going to get collected. So in Germany, we have the new technology of printing. We have many artists developing new ways of using this technology, such as working with the woodcut, for example. And printing creates new audiences, and new audiences for map consumption. And so as more maps are printed and more maps are collected, these maps are going to shape how people view distant places. In my case, was what I'm interested in is Brazil. And so these maps, you know, we can see them as ephemera, because even when they're printed in books, the books could become ephemera, such as collections that are perceived to be out of date. So like books of maps, for example, an atlas could be seen as something that is out of date and therefore discarded. Okay, so here we come to probably the most expensive piece of ephemera ever. I don't know if anyone can top me. This is worth $10 million. This is a very famous map that now hangs in permanent display at the Library of Congress. They had to create a special case for it that probably cost millions more. And this map is so famous because it's the first map that uses the word map. But this map was huge. This map was made to be like a wall hanging. It was meant to be like wallpaper. You put it up on the wall. It's like 8 feet by 4 feet. And it was printed on paper. It's a woodblock print on paper. So obviously there's this sense of impermanence about it, because if you're going to paste it up on a wall, you know that it's not going to last forever. Yet it was a huge production with a lot of artistic influence in it, a very elaborate border, very elaborate woodcut blocks. There were 12 different blocks that were cut. And so this is a very sophisticated map, and it was a map made by a humanist who was trying to join the information that was coming from Atlantic discoveries to the way humanists viewed the world, which was based on the rediscovery of the work of the Greek geographer Ptolemy, who I mentioned before. So this part of the map is all Ptolemy, and this part is influenced by the introduction of the kinds of knowledge that were on Portolano charts. So you can see the names here at right angles to the coast, and you can also see the depiction of the Americas. Well, the maker, oh gosh, should I stop now? I'm close to the end. Okay, so the maker of this map made another map a few years later and completely rejected this map. So the maker of the map, the cartographer, the humanist, saw this as now ephemera being replaced by this map, which is also in the Library of Congress, which you can see. And the only reason why this map survives is that a collector who was interested in cartography went and had this thing printed and then bound it in a book along with this chart and various others. And so for my purposes, what I'm interested in is the iconography that starts to appear to characterize Brazil, and the most prominent and dominant of these signs is the sign of the cannibal that starts to appear on printed maps and then becomes a shorthand that artists use to describe Brazil. So here you see another German map, 1540s. Brazil is signed as land of the cannibals by this teepee with legs dangling from it. And it becomes actually kind of a bag of cliches. It's easy for Brazil to be represented on maps because artists just know, oh yes, well that's the land of cannibalism, so we'll put that on the map. Okay, conclusion. So I've come to the conclusion so far, maps are and are not ephemera. I'm sorry to say there are too many maps to save them all. I think the role of collectors will be crucial. Maps have always been collected, maps will always be collected. I think we have to encourage collection and recognize that in the collecting there's also a story that's of interest to us. We're not just interested in, you know, all the maps in the world. We're interested in why people think these maps are important or why people think these maps are interesting enough to collect. So I think we do want the collector in there, but we want to encourage collectors of all stripes and eventually migrate their collections into archives. Thank you.